So believe it or not, the one thing that held up the making of this video the longest was I couldn't find the name of the congressman that helped set the whole entire thing in motion with addiction treatment. And I knew the history was a little bit more complex than just one congressman, saying we got to put people in treatment or whatever. But I literally was running into roadblocks everywhere trying to find that. I kept typing history of court-ordered treatment. I kept typing into search engines, when did court-ordered treatment begin? I started typing in about rehabilitation histories and all this other kind of thing. And I don't remember exactly what I typed in. You need almost like a magical word combination, like a password, to be able to finally get, what you're looking for sometimes with these search engines. They can be as frustrating as well, they're not quite like the old the card catalogs that we had in libraries growing up, but they can be about that frustrating from time to time if you don't know exactly what you're looking for. But the congressman in question I was talking about, his name was Harold Hughes. He was responsible for the Hughes Act. But in regards to how alcoholism became an actual disease and how it kind of hijacked the medical community and how it kind of ingrained itself into the public consciousness like we know it today, I had to go a little bit further back in history. Now, it's an interesting thing to bring up here because in the over a decade or so that I was in the 12 steps of recovery, my ass, the 12-step cult is what I actually meant to say. I was looking at the article right there that said recovery, and I said 12-step recovery when I was going to originally say 12-step cult. So it's another proof that guys can't multitask. But anyway, I was going to say that during the over a decade of time that I was in, the 12-step cult, the only time I ever heard about how AA kicked off, I only had a brief understanding of the Oxford group, which I read about in great detail through the Armbridge papers and found out a whole lot more about what kind of religious cult it really was, and how it got started as a religious cult. But 99% of the time in all of my time in AA, it was always the same old spiel, the same old story, how Bill and Bob got together and all of a sudden just magically, just like this, because they decided to work with other alcoholics, that it just turned into this, worldwide thing. It must be a miracle from God, is how a lot of people would usually tell the story in these odd, inspired tones. They would act like, can you just imagine two drunks got together and this whole entire thing became what it is today? Well, it may sound good for the movies. It may sound like something good in a Hollywood plot. We had to watch that movie in treatment where the actors James Woods and James Garner play Bill and Bob, and they make it look, so family friendly. Like it kind of reinforces the bullshit ideas of what people perceive AA as being, is this, just a nice group of people just trying to help each other out, But the reality of the whole entire situation is a little bit more complex than that. Now, I don't have all the sources in front of me at the moment. There's an archived website that I looked up. It was from, I don't know if I'm saying the last name properly, but it was Ken Raggy's book about the myths of alcoholism, AA and alcoholism treatment and all that other kind of stuff exposed. It had links to several great online books. There was one called Saints Gone Mad, written from a decidedly Christian perspective, but it detailed all the abuses of the Oxford group and what they were really like, which Bill and Bob were good members of before they branched out. Now, of course, there's a little bit of shade in the history there. Did the Oxford group just get sick of Bill W. trying to bring around a whole bunch of people that had drinking problems, and they just told him, to hit the road? Or was it a situation where Bill was just such an egomaniac that he couldn't tolerate not having, the absolute control and the absolute power over the whole entire thing? But I do remember reading, and I'm going to try to stay focused here because there's a lot of source material here, so I don't want to jump all over the place while I'm doing this. But I do remember reading, like around 1938, 1939, something like that, AA was kind of broke. financially wise. I mean, it had one little kind of meeting area or something like that near Grand Central Station in one part of New York or whatever, but it wasn't certainly nowhere near this idea that, you know, a couple of guys started talking about how we need to help one another, and it just went worldwide like that. But well, what I got to looking about was I found about Marty Mann. Now, I knew that Marty Mann, I knew she was instrumental in creating AA as it is today, but I didn't know anything about it during my time in the cult. In all the meetings I ever attended, nobody ever really mentioned her. Nobody really ever talked about her. They never, I don't know if anybody ever was forced to go to those things they call tradition studies and step studies and big book studies where they read every sentence in the book and they take every single word and they act like, you know, he didn't say we should, he said we must, or, you know, just one little word and they're just completely tripping over it like, you know, these words are being chiseled onto stones from lightning in the sky like Charlton Heston on the mountain with God or whatever in that movie. But there's really no mention of Marty Mann that I ever heard of in my time in it. There were a few so-called self-proclaimed AA historians, but they were kind of like the other, like the Buddhist guy I was talking about in the last video. They generally just like to hear themselves talk. They didn't ever really give us a rundown on anything. It's kind of like, and then I got to get back on topic, but I want to make this as a side note. It's kind of like how I was told a long time in AA, it was occasionally used for Beshara too, that somebody started moderation management, they killed somebody in a drunk driving accident, moderation management was just completely destroyed after that. Found out that was totally blatantly false. I've got a video on it somewhere in my history here. But anyway, the point being, everything you hear in AA is genuinely bullshit when it comes to history, you know. But in all my searching, the first thing I found, now I got to browse through this article a little bit because this article is so pro-AA. It's so pro-Marty Mann that I can't read some of these paragraphs verbatim here. I can copy a link and post it in the description, but YouTube's been kind of funny here lately. They've been like, I'll post a link to somebody online, and then the next thing I know, the link is not there. Just my comment. I don't know what that is. I mean, if anybody else has experienced that, you know, maybe let me know, but I can try to post a link in the video description and see if it'll carry through, but I got to put all kinds of warnings on that because it's so pro-AA, so pro-Marty Mann, so pro-everything, you know, recovery related, that it'll really make you kind of ill. So I'm going to kind of browse through the one. It's from the Washington Post, and it's, and I was trying to pick out key points, but it's kind of hard to do because, like, the first part of the article, they're making this long dramatic tale, kind of like, you know, when you read Bill's story in the beginning of the big book, it reads like some kind of a really bad melodrama that you would see on a made-for-TV movie, you know, it's something like that. But it says that Marty Mann was a brilliant strategist and a public relations genius who played a crucial role in the mid-century alcoholism advocacy. Today, she's largely forgotten, even to many of the most ardent AA devotees, despite the fact that she might have been more important to the rise of AA's popularity than the founder, Bill Wilson himself. Bill Wilson stole a bunch of shit from a group called the Oxford Group, so he's not no founder. I mean, unless, you know, that'd be like me writing a book that was almost verbatim to something that Charles Dickens wrote, and it said, you know, I'm the original author of that book. You know, I just changed some language around, but I am. That's about what we're talking about here. World's greatest ripoff artist is all he was, not a founder. But it says, as many critics have noted, AA was created by and for those in power at the time. That's probably because that's all the Oxford Group was interested in. They was interested in you if you had a lot of money, if you could give them a lot of money, and if you could recruit more people that would also give them money. Okay, that was the Oxford Group ultimately. They did have a very cult-like practice, and they did want to attract people in power. I mean, the founder, Frank Buckman, said he wanted a world where only a few men, under the guidance of God, were governing a worldwide dictatorship. And by the way, Bill W. was a good member at the time that shit was going on. The apple didn't fall far from the tree there. But it says, as many critics have noticed, AA was created by and for those in power, namely white men, Protestant, middle-aged professionals, and it wasn't easy for women in the early AA days. there's a little bit of, I'm a little bit on the fence about the way AA was as far as accepting women, because, I mean, Bill Wilson had a steady supply of people to prey on, just like the men in AA today have a steady supply of girls that come straight out of treatment that they can deal drugs to, and they can get them hooked so long as they'll do whatever they want, and then they kick them to the curb, and they say, well, it's not our fault they relapsed. The program, it's not for everybody. And, that's a common, very practice. So I don't know if Bill would have been vehemently opposed to women joining. I mean, he certainly didn't have a problem preying on anybody that was new, and he later on said, well, my wife is more like a mother than anything else to me anyway. So, but I'm pretty sure, just given the time period and the way the decade worked, they probably weren't too happy about it. This group of upper class, professional, Protestant, hardline kind of guys probably weren't, it was more like, well, we'll accept a woman, but as long as she doesn't speak, and as long as she doesn't share, and as long as she kind of stays in the back and knows her place. That's my guess. I don't have no clue. I wasn't there. But anyway, the prevailing stereotype of female alcoholics were sexually promiscuous, neglectful mothers, sicker than men, and harder to cure, which AA, by the way, loved pushing. If you ever read the if you ever read the chapter to wives, it's very obvious. The wife tells the husband, that all the smoking you're doing in the house, and by the way, I am a smoker, but all the smoking you're doing in the house is getting on my nerves. And he says, frankly, I'm not ready to quit. And then he gets drunk, and the chapter concludes with a happy Bill W. ending. The wife knows her place. She should have shut up and not said anything. Otherwise, the guy would have got drunk. That was, AA wasn't some organization that was way ahead of its time in terms of visionary about women's rights or anything like that. I mean, just read the chapter to wives. That ought to tell you all you know about the attitudes of people that were in early AA. But many men in AA referred alcoholic women to their wives rather than trying to help the women themselves. You mean the ones they didn't prey on mercilessly like they do today. It used to kill me how one guy in an AA meeting, I knew it was a rabid 13-stepper that was always, he always had some newcomer that had just got fresh out of rehab or barely off the streets that he would take advantage of and then kick to the side when they would start using their drugs again or whatever. That was always saying the men should stick with the men and the women should stick with the women. That was one thing he would say every single meeting, and he didn't do any of that, of course. So I'm not sure any AA men were referring people to their wives. And then, of course, we get a little dramatic paragraph about arriving in Manhattan in 1939, blah, 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 blah. So we'll just go on down here, because, these are little quotes by Marty Mann talking about how wonderful it was to, find people just like me and all this other kind of thing. And then Mann was outwardly different from other AA members. She was a lesbian, and her partner later joined AA. They were among the first women to be long-term members and certainly among the first LGBTQ people. Nevertheless, she found enormous strength in the mutual identity of an alcoholic. Well, anything you are in AA is second. Alcoholic is first. And I'm a little skeptical of that because, there was a guy in one part of their literature that they called a strange alcoholic, because not only was he a drug addict, but he had a problem. He was supposedly had a problem, is the way they classified it, meaning that, he was attracted to other men, or I think they said he was a cross-dresser or something like that. And of course, it was spun in such a way that, and Bill W. and everybody got together and they said, what would the father do? And they allowed him to be in there. I mean, you got to take it with a grain of salt about this shit, because AA is certainly no progressive organization, and AA certainly was not, like some champion of the rights of the LGBTQ community, which this article from the Washington Post makes it sound like, they were all so graciously accepting of her. I'm a little bit skeptical on that, but it says Mann threw herself into the fellowship, which grew slowly. In 1939, Bill and Lois Wilson, Mann, and a few others drove to Cleveland to help establish a new meeting. In front of the crowd, Mann quipped, wouldn't it be wonderful if someday we could travel across the country and find an AA meeting in every single town? It was a joke, and the 100 or so people actually laughed. For Mann, though, it was only a half joke. In their own circle, and I think this is important, many people were relapsing and even dying in the AA circle itself, so the idea of a nationwide AA was considered ridiculous. So even back then, you know, so many old-timers are always talking about, oh yeah, back in the old days, everybody got sober and everybody stayed sober. And nobody ever relapsed again because they did it like the first 100. That's all bullshit. There never was actually an entire first 100 that stayed sober. They had horrible failure rates. In fact, if you look at the Orange papers online, Bill W. says at one point, you had no idea how many failures we had in those days. We had to cull over hundreds of thousands of drunks just to get a handful to take the bait. If you're telling me you got to cull over hundreds of thousands of people to take the bait, you're not a successful program. In sobriety, Mann was dynamic, and then we got to go on here with some more pro-AA bullshit in the paragraphs. And then it says, at one point, she had a job that she was producing radio programs on American history. But and of course here they go into this thing about she woke up in the middle of the night with a spiritual epiphany. I mean, is this the Washington fucking Post, or is this a pro-AA article right out of the fucking grapevine? But it says her plan was to reach not just scientists and medical professionals, but everybody in society. Her project was to medicalize alcoholism. She wanted alcoholism to be made into a disease just like any other disease, one that would be recognized and treated as such. Mann attributed this notion of disease to AA, but the main AA text she was reading only used the term disease once, and generally in AA at the time, overwhelmingly the problem was looked at as spiritual rather than physical. Well, it still is. Go to any meeting and all they do is blabber about spirituality. You never hear them talking about what alcohol can do to your liver. You never hear what alcohol can do to, you know, like your brain as far as receptors and all that other kind of stuff. You never hear anything medical in AA. It's all about the only time they talk about anything physical is when they're saying you got an allergy, you know, and then of course somebody has to say, oh, I'm allergic to alcohol. When I drink, I break out in handcuffs, and everybody has to laugh like they haven't heard that fucking joke a million times. But it says in 1941, the U.S. Public Health Service had issued an important publication framing alcoholism as a public health problem rather than an immoral behavior. Well, AA is all about morality. They push a 19th century Christian dogmatic morality on everybody, which is not really even moral at all. You know, you got to put the cult before everything else in your life anyway. So AA is lying when they say that it's not a moral problem, and then they go to blabber about God and spirituality and morals and how our instincts have gone awry, that, you know, our sexual instincts are far exceeding their intended purpose. Coming from a guy who is a serial womanizer like Bill W. That's really interesting, I find. But anyway, somewhere along the way, she meets this group of scientists. They established a group called the Research Council on Problems of Alcohol. Let me guess, they were all 12-steppers. At Yale University, some researchers involved with the council began conducting studies engaging in state-level advocacy and promoting a scientific vision of alcoholism. Well, the Washington Post just lied. Again, this is not scientific. There's nothing about this that was scientific. Never was. You know, every so often AA people will tout these studies that they proved, you know, that it proves that they're correct. And if you go to the Orange Papers website, a lot of those studies were done and conducted by, guess what, people involved in AA, families of AA, etc., etc., etc. There is the case of George Valiant that said he was going to prove AA worked. And after studying it for a long time, he found that AA actually had worse outcomes for people with drinking problems versus the people that had no drinking problems at all. So here we go again. This was probably written by a 12-stepper, you know, or at least the way the media treats 12 steps. They always treat it as some wonderful thing in the media and the pop culture, and it all starts, ironically enough, because of this article that's pointing out the history of it. And it says she moved in with some family in New Haven, spent the summer studying alcoholism. How did she study alcoholism? Did she go to AA meetings? In 1944, Marty Mann held a news conference to announce a new national organization to combat alcoholism. And then, of course, we get more fan mail-like letter here in the article, but it said her organization would become, which would later in time become the National Council on Alcoholism. It would embark on a campaign to convince the public, first and foremost, that alcoholism is a disease. So it's not scientific at all. Again, it's a political thing. But the positive feedback between grassroots organizations and high-level connections. It was the birth of what scholars have come to call the modern alcoholism movement. Modern alcoholism movement, meaning we're still stuck in the 1930s with it. So eventually she helped establish the American Society of Addiction Medicine, the nation's largest professional organization of its kind. And it's really funny how the nation's largest professional organizations of its kind tends to find that AA works better than anything else. Funny how that works. It's kind of like sometimes I've seen before in the past, like a corrupt and crooked corporation. It will actually launch an investigation into its own self, and it will conclude that it did nothing wrong. And I'm like, that's just so surprising. I never dreamed that some major corporation that's violating all kinds of laws and violating all kinds of ethics and everything else, when it launches its own independent investigation, it concludes it didn't do nothing wrong. It's kind of like these advocacy groups that research themselves and say, yeah, AA works better than anything else, So it was in 1956 the American Medical Association adopted a resolution recognizing alcoholism as a medical problem. There is something I could point out from the AMA back in 1939 that actually said the Big Book had no scientific value to it whatsoever. But it was stuff like this that caused the change in that. Mann later on leaned in connections with politicians. Here we go. Now we're getting to the rub here. President Lyndon B. Johnson, once a member of the Texas NCA, announced a new program in special health messages to Congress declaring alcoholism is a disease which will eventually yield to scientific research and adequate treatment, except it never did. It just institutionalized a cult religion. And now we're getting to Harold Hughes. It says, 2 years later, Mann and the NCA rejoiced when Harold Hughes, an AA member and openly recovering alcoholic, was elected to the Senate, where he proceeded to work for federal legislation on alcoholism and arranged for Mann to be in front of Congress. In 1970, Congress passed a comprehensive alcoholism act known as the Hughes Act. President Richard Nixon, or Tricky Dicky, if you remember those, if you ever had any parents back in the 60s that were a part of or anybody from the 60s that was involved in any kind of countercultural thing, they probably could tell you all about Tricky Dicky. And they could probably tell you about roach clips that you could smoke marijuana with that had Nixon given a peace symbol on it, but I'm getting into history there. This is for the older viewers, if you remember. But anyway, it says Nixon left the bill in a pocket veto, but at the last minute, Mann's wealthy Republican allies put a lot of backdoor political pressure on the president to sign the bill into law the last day of 1970, December of 1970. It was the first significant federal legislation on alcoholism. Not only did it create the National Institute on Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism, NIAAA, which, by the way, is unabashedly pro-AA. Funny how that worked. But it laid the groundwork for today's system of addiction treatment in legal matters and in treatment center and rehab matters. Soon after the Hughes Act made it through Congress, Mann gave a speech declaring an end to the America's 150-year war of alcohol versus alcoholism. Oh my God, that reminds me of these old-timers I used to see in meetings that would say, there's a big difference between alcohol and alcoholism. Whoa, that's some heavy shit, Alcohol is a fluid in a bottle, okay? If I don't break the seal on it, it can't do anything to me. And no, I'm not powerless over alcoholic thinking. That was another thing the gurus would do. There was one guru that would say, well, you may not be powerless over alcohol, but you're powerless over alcoholic thinking. And I was like, that's so deep, It's just bullshit. It's just semantics and bullshit. But anyway, it says that the supposed evil of demon rum had attached itself to alcoholics. This was the origin of the stigma. No, this is not the origin of the stigma. The stigma is something that AA creates. AA created a stigma about people who have addiction, and it's seeped into mainstream society today. Tell anybody that you had a problem with alcohol, and they'll judge you like that's what you must be judged by and how you must be examined and looked at for the rest of your fucking life. And then it goes on to say, this. Let's see. But then her NCA had brought together two important countervailing forces: science my ass, and alcoholics in the form of AA. Okay, there you go. Science. It was all about science. It had nothing to do with you leaning on all your Republican friends in Congress to get Richard Nixon to pass the bill. It had nothing to do with you buddying up with really powerful people like Hughes, who was an evangelical guy that claimed he tried to commit suicide and had a spiritual experience, got into Congress and decided, well, you know what? We need to push this on everybody now. In fact, a lot of laws about alcohol, a lot of laws that, if you ever think of a certain alcohol law or a blue state type law that you would imagine as being utterly ludicrous, it's probably because of these particular councils that passed all this shit in the 1970s. Now, it does say the article is adapted from The Urge, Our History of Addiction by Carl Eric Fisher, and I know that 26 minutes into this, so I'm going to try to wrap it up here real quickly. I did look up Carl Fisher online. I haven't read his book. He's actually got a book out there, but I looked at an article of his, and in his article he was saying that addiction itself is very complex. It's very multifaceted. There's a lot of factors at play in addiction, and that addiction shouldn't necessarily be treated as a disease, in the sense of the way it's inundated into the public as being perceived of as this disease that you have to abstain from for the rest of your life. That there are people in many studies that are shown to return to moderate drinking. There's even people addicted to really hard drugs that have actually been able to moderate use. I mean, I'm not advocating you try to go out and moderate based on what I'm saying here, but I am agreeing with him in the fact that, yeah, addiction is not a one-size-fits-all approach. Many people get addicted for a lot of different reasons. Many people behave when they're addicted in a variety of different ways. There's a lot of root causes behind addiction, and it's not some spiritual problem with instincts gone awry, as Bill W. called it, who had no understanding of instincts whatsoever. So I'll have to maybe look up more on him. I don't know if his book is available online. I don't know if it's out of print or not. I just saw that one article by him online when I was doing research for this video. But yeah, if you want to know why you have drug courts and alcohol rehabs and halfway houses and the multi-billion-dollar a year treatment industry that you've got today, you have Harold Hughes, I almost said Howard Hughes, the guy with the OCD, the millionaire, and you have Marty Mann to thank for that, and you have Richard Nixon to thank for that, and you have a whole bunch of people in Congress and the Senate that probably deep down inside just realize, you know what, we stand to make a lot of money off of this, is probably what the really deciding factor was in the whole entire thing to begin with. I mean, I've never heard of a politician doing anything out of the sheer goodness of his heart, unless there's something in it for him. Anyway, that's pretty much the synopsis that I could find. I'm sure there's more in-depth information to be read and understood about. I'm only scratching a little bit of a surface with this, but I thought I would put this out here because I did promise it from last week. But if you want to know why we've got a country in the shape it's in right now, as far as 12-step rehabs and 12-step treatment and AA being spun in positive lights and everything and seeping into our popular culture, yeah, you have to just go back to the year 1970. Anyway, until next time.